It's December, and that means Christmas is coming, but is the NHL season? That's what we're still waiting to find out. It's Tuesday, and this is the HockeyDebates.com podcast. Welcome, everyone. I'm Bob Duff, and I'm going to throw it over to my podcast partner, Kevin Allen, to introduce today's guest.
Yes, hello, everyone. Our special guest is Jan Levine of HockeyBuzz.com, who covers the New York Rangers, does a good job of chronicling the comings and goings of that franchise. And Jan, Bob sort of hit the nail on the head. We're not sure when we're going to have hockey, but we anticipate we will have hockey. And probably the best guess is January. And probably there's not too many teams that are excited about the start of the season as the Rangers. A lot of good things have happened to that organization in the last 6 months or so, including getting the number one draft pick in Alexis Lafreniere. And this is a team that looked very good at the end of last season. On a 1 to 10 scale, how optimistic are you that this team will make the playoffs, regardless of where they end up, what division we end up putting them in?
Probably put it somewhere between a 7 and an 8. I still think there's some certain questions around this lineup. We've talked a lot about it before, Kevin, on some other mediums, but especially, defense. First pairing defense with Jacob Trouba, whether or not they really have a good second line center in Ryan Strome that's become, to say it mildly, a polarizing figure among Rangers faithful in terms of their viewpoint of him as their number 2C. And then also clearly what's going to happen with a lot of the young kids. I mean, you mentioned Lafreniere, and clearly getting the number 1 pick this year and then the number 2 pick the year before with Capo Caco accelerates the rebuild or retool, whichever term you like to use. But clearly development of those young guys and how quickly that development manifests itself on the ice. So Kako, Philip Hedl, you look at the pipeline of young defensemen and when they're going to come up, what's going to happen in terms of the bottom 6, and then clearly between the pipes with Igor Shesterkin taking over for the Kings. So there's a whole host of questions. I think a lot of things potentially will go right, but as we all know, not everything goes 100% right. So that's probably why I'm putting it between a 7 and an 8. And they're still in a pretty tough division, though, as you mentioned. None of us know exactly how those divisions are going to be aligned right now.
It's always fascinating and a little bit curious when an entrenched star vanishes from a team, and obviously Lundqvist has kind of been the face of the Rangers for a long time. Now, there's certainly no doubt that Shesterkin is a tremendous prospect, but we've seen some of even the greats in the NHL in goaltending have their early struggles. I mean, it is a challenging, maybe more so mentally than physically, to move into that role. I mean, he's not the vaunted prospect anymore. Now he's the man, and he's expected to be the man. You think he'll have any speed bumps in making this transition?
I think he'll have some. I think his play in the KHL lends some credence to the fact that I don't think he's going to be overwhelmed. I mean, you just look at the numbers he put up in the KHL and the numbers he put up at Hartford last year, warranting the call-up. Clearly, there's a lot of pressure on him stepping in between the pipes for the King. I mean, there's no question. Just given what Lundqvist meant to this organization, and all of us as Ranger fans kind of put a lot of credence on the fact that they didn't always do a good job of putting the talent around him. I think Shesterkin has a lot more talent potentially around him than Lundqvist did, except maybe in 2014-15. But he's got a nice backup in Alexander Georgiev that can take some of the pressure off him, as you and both Kevin mentioned. Since we don't know what the season's going to look like, we may have a lot of back-to-backs. We may have a lot of 2 games in 3 nights. You're going to have kind of a 2-goalie hybrid system to a certain extent to get through the myriad of games, depending on how many we play. So not all of the pressure is going to be on Shesterkin, but I do think he's shown in the past, given his performance in the KHL and in Hartford, that he clearly is going to be up to the task. And he also stepped in rather nicely last year and pretty much arrested the number 1 goaltending role away from Lundqvist, and would have opened the playoffs as that number 1 if he hadn't suffered a minor injury beforehand.
Jan, I'm sure Shesterkin would be probably number 1 in the key players for the Rangers in terms of whether they'll make the playoffs. But give me your top 3 of the key players that really have to step up in order for this team to make the playoffs.
Well, I think it's the top 2 again from last year. I mean, we saw what Mika Zibanejad did, especially when Artemi Panarin missed a little bit of time, and then Zibanejad, once he came back from his injury, he was on fire. I mean, he was absolutely scoring at will. The pandemic probably hit at the worst time possible for him, given what he was putting up. On the flip side, same thing for Panarin. I mean, the Breadman was playing tremendously well, although The last 8 games before the pandemic hit, he hadn't scored, and that was some question marks. Then he struggled a bit in the 3-game play-in round when they got swept by Carolina. So you look at those 2 guys clearly, and then for me, it's honestly, what do you see out of Jacob Trouba this year? Kevin, you and I have talked a lot about Trouba coming from Michigan. I thought at the time the giving up the first-round pick, giving back the first-round pick to Winnipeg technically because they got him in the Kevin Hayes trade, and then giving up Neil Pionk was an overpayment. But if you look on the broad scale of what he produced last year, you can almost argue that Pionk outproduced him, at least offensively. And the problem is Trouba, with the Anthony D'Angelo playing so well and Adam Fox playing so well, both those guys kind of usurped some power play time away from Trouba, taking away some of the skill set that he has. So to me, finding that number 1 pair of defensemen on the left side and Trouba, playing like you hoped you were going to get the Trouba from 2 years ago and Dustin Byfuglien out. If Trouba can play that way, or they find a guy to move up, either it's D'Angelo moving to the left side, it's Libor Hayek maybe pairing with him, dare I say Jack Johnson maybe playing a key role, which scares everybody to death who's a Ranger fan. But if they can get somebody who can kind of pair with Trouba and let his talents show on the ice, that'll go a long way for them being a much better team defensively, but also providing the support in front of Shesterkin or Georgiev, regardless of who's in net.
I might argue that Shesterkin, Adam Fox, and Strom are the key guys, just because, one thing you could say about Panarin, even though he has droughts, by the end of the season, his consistency in the NHL has been remarkable. You can count pretty much on what his production is going to be. As Zibanejad has also kind of become that player. But, I'm not sure that Strom can duplicate, the effort he had last year. And, of course, Adam Fox was so good, but, with younger players, can he still do the same thing? Argue back with me on why you think those guys can do what they did a year ago or improve on it.
So a couple of things. So Fox is, we always use the adage of defenseman growth is not linear, and there's no question, right? We see roller coasters and ups and downs from these guys. Fox, though, to me, what was most impressive for Fox wasn't just offensively; it was the play in his own zone, right? You saw he made those little movements to free himself from the puck, those exit strategies that he had. Also, to me, that's something that I think that's repeatable. So maybe if the offense suffers, I think he's going to be better defensively from having gone through another year. And I think Jacques Martin did a pretty good job in Pittsburgh with that blue line. Not great. Granted, he didn't have an enormous amount of talent to work around, especially beyond Chris Letang. But Martin's system is something that I think is probably going to be better suited for the Rangers, who struggled both under Ulf Samuelsson as well as under, Lindy Ruff. So Strome, look, everybody knows what Strome is, right? I think all of us' viewpoint is when they were going to sign him to a longer-term deal, what are you going to get out of Ryan Strome? And that's, I think, why he was on the block until right before the arbitration hearing. He also got signed right before the arbitration hearing. The 2-year deal was to give him the opportunity to expose him to Seattle, which I think we all think is going to be exposed. So I do think to a certain extent he is a product of Panarin, but if Panarin is that good, that means vis-a-vis Strome will end up being that good as well. And with Shesterkin, look, there's a lot of pressure on him. But the good part is the Rangers have Georgiev, who's manned the pipes at times also. And they also can allow Shesterkin to kind of settle in. And I don't think the moment's going to be too big for him. So you may see some bobbles from him, but I do think he's mentally strong enough and talented enough that I don't think that's going to have a lasting impact in terms of his overall performance between the pipes.
Last year, there was a lot of love for the Rangers going into the postseason. I know myself, I picked them to upset the Hurricanes. Did we just fall in love with them too much and all their young talent and put them further along the learning curve than maybe they were?
I think a couple of things came up last year. First of all, the lack of depth was fairly evident when Jesper Fast went out 63 seconds into the game on the first game. And you saw what David Quinn talked about, what the loss of Fast meant, which is why also I was one of those pounding the pavement to kind of hope he'd come back regardless of the depth up front, because at $2 million, given where he went to Carolina, wasn't an overpayment. B, as you mentioned, I think we were hoping for more from the young kids. And actually, guys like Capo Caco and the other guys didn't have bad series, but the big names, Panarin didn't produce, Strome didn't produce, Zibanejad didn't produce, Kreider didn't produce, who was coming back from his own injury. They missed Igor Shesterkin. And the first game, they actually had a shot. It was 3-2 late. They had a shot to beat him. They were whitewashed in the second game. In terms of playing in the third game, they just got outclassed. I think part of it is I think we underestimated just how good Carolina is, even when James Reimer was between the pipes, who, in my opinion, kind of outplayed Peter Mrazek in the playoffs. So I think it was a combination. I think, one, we may have overestimated just how good New York was. B, I think we underestimated the impact of the time frame between the pandemic hitting and the playoffs beginning. And I think thirdly, the other piece of the puzzle is we underestimated just how good Carolina really is.
I asked a NHL scout what we might expect out of Lafreniere in his first season, and he said, his game is more mature than Capocaco, and so he'll probably be a little bit more productive. But obviously, we're not going to see the best of him for a few years. But what are you hearing coming out of the Rangers in terms of what the expectations are for him this season?
Well, I mean, I think the expectations are high. I mean, the only question is, where does he start, right? We've talked about they're fairly loaded on the left side. Panarin, Kreider, and Lafreniere. Now, unless one of those guys moves to the right side, where does all three of them start the season? A lot of the speculation is they'll move Chris Kreider down to the third line just because he's not one of those guys that's going to get his back up in terms of being moved down. But I do think what's going to be most impressive from Lafreniere, and I think what a lot of Ranger fans we'll see, is he's willing to go to the dirty areas, right? A lot of us know just how good he is skill-wise, but what a lot of people have talked about is the physical nature of his play. He's willing to take a hit. He's willing to dish a hit, and he probably brings a lot more of a physical element than most of us are expecting. And I think that's what, when we can get into the arenas and watch them, I think that's what a lot of the Ranger fans will like, the fact that the guy's willing to use his body to create space and also utilize space to be able to score. So I'm not going to put a number on him, but I do think if he doesn't substantively outperform what Kakko did in his first year, it would be considered a major disappointment.
About a year ago last fall, I was at a charity event, and one of the people there was John Davidson, and we had a long talk about the Rangers. It wasn't long after he'd been hired by the team. And he liked what they had, but he really seemed to downplay how close they were to being, a team that could fight for a playoff spot and be a contender. Do you think maybe this team caught their own management by surprise last year?
Well, I think absolutely. I think things coalesced a lot quicker than expected. I mean, Zibanejad was on the roll. Panarin was on the roll early on. Then you had Shesterkin step in. I think he went 10-2 his first 12 games before the auto accident between him and Pavel Buchnevich. I do think that the rebuild or retool was supposed to be a lot elongated, but they ended up getting, they got in the same draft. They got Philip Hedl, who started to show some signs. They got Kakko, that accelerated a bit. Now you got Lafreniere. That's accelerating the time frame a little bit. You look at the pipeline with Keandre Miller, with Niels Lundqvist hopefully coming down the pike. We really don't know what's going to be with Vitaly Kravtsov. I do think that the Rangers probably expected 21-22 would be when they start to build moving forward. So I think last year kind of took everything by storm. There is still a lot of work to be done, especially defensively. There's a lack of a true identity in the bottom six that has to be identified. They've taken some steps towards doing so by re-signing Brendan Lemieux, maybe by signing Kevin Rooney. Maybe we'll see what happens with Julien Gauthier, but there is still an identity crisis in terms of what the bottom six, and then more importantly, what the bottom pairing defense is going to be like. That's also a major area of need or uncertainty right now. So David Quinn, though, I will say, has a little bit of a target on his back, because if they regress a little bit, and given the expectation that seems to be amongst the league and also amongst the Rangers fan base, I do think he's going to have a little bit more difficulty, because there's been questions in terms of how they've handled Kravtsov, how they've handled Hedl, how they've handled, obviously, the Elias Anderson situation. So not everything is, roses in Rangerland right now, but there is a higher expectation based upon what's transpired the last couple of seasons.
Let's explore that a little bit, Jan. Who has benefited by Quinn's presence behind the bench, and who maybe would have done better with a different style of coach?
I think Tony DeAngelo has clearly benefited. I think Quinn's hard knock style, for lack of a better term, and making him and holding him to task has helped him, right? I think the part of the years past, if you remember correctly, and you saw last year the playoffs, there was always question with Alain Vigneault in terms of defensive deployment, in terms of the system. And as you guys saw, playing the shell when it comes to having a third period lead was kind of a hallmark of that organization. Now with Quinn, you'd like to see the growth of some of these players. You'd like to see the usage of these players. I mean, I think Pavel Buchnevich benefited a little bit. But on the flip side, some of the young guys, maybe Hedl, especially, Anderson had a great training camp. He didn't see the ice at all. You saw with Kravtsov also, they ended up sending him down, which partly could be salary cap reasons. So there's clear questions in terms of utilization, especially of some of the European guys. I'm not saying it's only the European guys, but those are some of the guys in the draft most recently who have not necessarily displayed their talents compared to some of the others, which has raised some of the questions in terms of their deployment and usage.
You talk about DeAngelo. Obviously, he's a guy that, we always complain in the media about athletes never having anything to say, and he's certainly got a very polarizing personality on social media, and a lot of people don't like it because maybe his politics don't agree with theirs. Do you think the team has any concerns about that with him being so opinionated on social media?
Publicly, no. Privately, my speculation is yes. I mean, if you remember correctly, there were some tweets that came out right around the election from D'Angelo, and then all of a sudden, mysteriously, his Twitter account had been suspended. And I think part of that may have been, and granted, I'm using that in quotes, might have been the team management and public relations kind of saying, hey, you need to kind of tone it down a little bit. Now, granted, he still has his podcast, Watch Your Tone, which is actually a pretty good listen with some of the guys. And he doesn't really get that political in terms of the tweets that are coming out from that podcast. But a lot of things that came out from his own Twitter account raised the hackles of some of the people and raised the ire of a lot of the people. And granted, look, you can believe whatever you want politically, but I do think he did go over the line a little bit in one specific incident, especially as related to a COVID-related tweet, which may have been misinterpreted in terms of how he meant it. And I do think that Ranger brass probably are not enamored with his view. Clearly, they can't stop him. I mean, they could tell him not to, but I'm not sure they'd go that way. But I do think behind the scenes, there is some consternation in terms of some of the tweets that he sent out.
Well, Jan, we've run out of time, but we appreciate having you on and providing insight to what's going on with the Rangers. Hope when we get started to have you on again.
I appreciate it. Thanks, guys, for having me. Looking forward to it.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
That was Jan Levine, HockeyBuzz.com. Who does a good job of, as I said, chronicling what's happening in with the Ranger squad. And, it's interesting how his take on, Quinn. Like, I think the general impression of Quinn outside of New York is, he's an up-and-coming coach who, kind of the prototype of the modern coach, communicator in terms of being able to get into the players' kitchens and getting them going. But it's, as he saw, it's not all rainbows and unicorns there. There's some issues. Some players, haven't responded well to his style. So it's never one size fits all with coaching. For every guy that likes a coach, there's another who thinks, he doesn't know what he's doing.
What was Harry Neal's famous quote that 5 guys love you and 5 guys hate you and the other 10 aren't sure. So you want to survive, you got to get the 5 guys who love you to hang around with the 10 guys who aren't sure. Yeah.
No, that's exactly right. Well, Bob, let's talk a little bit about what's going to happen here. The latest reports are that they've talked a little bit over the weekend. They being Donald Fear and Gary Bettman. And I talked to a GM last night who said that he's talked to a lot of folks around the league. And the general consensus is that it really is unfair what the league is asking the players to do, given that they just negotiated this contract. And, it was probably ill-advised. Now you can argue that the league simply didn't know what was going to happen with COVID-19. But now they're asking them to give more, even though they've agreed to a deal beforehand, and the players have the advantage. But really, they have no leverage in this situation. If they want to be paid, they have to play games. So the quicker they start, the more games they're going to pay, and the more money they're going to earn. So it's they're in kind of a bad spot, and ultimately they may not like what's happening, but I think eventually they'll come around. And I know our esteemed colleague Pierre LeBrun has been saying that maybe mid-January might be more realistic. I've kind of said that all along, that I thought it'd be hard to get going January 1st, and I thought it would be a little bit more into the month. But I don't think it's any question we're going to play. It's just a matter of when.
Yeah, I think we'll play too. But when you hear reports that I've seen from people that have the connections to know that this is fact, that there's about a third of the owners of the teams in the NHL wouldn't mind if there wasn't a season, because they think they're just going to, and I'm sure those are not the Toronto market or the New York market. It's probably markets where, they don't make a lot of money and they need ticket revenue to survive. And, they're looking at how much they're going to have to put out in expenses to get a season going against how much less revenue they're going to bring in than they normally would.
Yeah, that's right. We don't have a straw poll on who it is that doesn't want to play, but it's understandable. Like, the reason that owners become, or at least people become rich, is because they watch all of their nickels. So, nobody wants to lose $70 million. I don't care how much money you have. Um, but and I got on a soapbox. I think it was the last podcast, the one before, though. But I do believe that you have a obligation when you accept a sports team that you got to look out for the fans' best interest in your community. So even though some owners would like not to play because they don't want to lose all that money, I think they have an obligation to do that, and I think a lot of them do. A third is still only 10 teams. That means there's 20 teams that say, "Hey, I'll lose money, but let's play." So I think for the most part, they're ready to play, because if they were real militant about it, I don't think we would be seeing hockey. So obviously, the majority of teams are ready to play, and if you think about it, the television contract doesn't pay out enough. Unlike in football, they need gate revenue in order to survive, and they have $5 billion in revenue normally, so that means that player contracts are half that, 2.5 billion. That's 31 teams times 81.5 million. So you can just see just that you have to have gate revenue in order to do it. Now, we just in the last 48 hours have heard that before they were saying the end of the second quarter or start of the third for everyone who in America who wanted a vaccination would receive it. Now they're saying that by June, everyone in America will have a vaccination who wants it. So if that's the case, now we're talking about the possibility of fans, I think, some fans anyway, in arenas for playoff time, which I think would help. Although I will say this, I would caution the league to come out of the gate at playoff time and think they're going to tell everybody when you're going to have to play playoff prices to see hockey, because I think they've been holding their money all season long. And if I was owners of teams, I'd be saying, hey, as a gift to you all, you pay regular season prices for your playoff tickets. If that's the way it goes. I mean, I don't really know. Maybe we won't see any fans, but it seems like there's more of a possibility today than there was yesterday, just because of what they're saying about how the vaccine will be distributed. But, I think there might be a little insurrection if they come out and say, well, we're going up to playoff prices, even though it is playoffs. And they've been holding your money, and now all of a sudden they're going to say it's $180 to $200 a ticket.
Yeah, I mean, you wonder how this is all going to play out. I mean, you start looking around, and the landscape doesn't look promising when you see today the Finnish second division announced they're shutting down the season, and the Quebec Junior League, which tried to play in the fall, has now shuttered its league until at least January. And the Western Hockey League, there's been some suggestions that they were talking, optimistically getting started next month. Now it looks like they're looking at February. So you're seeing, evidence from other leagues, granted not the NHL, but that the virus is winning.
Right. Well, doesn't it seem a little nuts that we're going to try to play the World Junior Championships with teams coming in from other countries? And, I don't know. I hope for the best, but, I've on other podcasts been, sounding the be prepared warning. I mean, all you got to do is look at the NFL, what's happening there. I mean, we had a wide receiver starting at quarterback for the Denver Broncos yesterday because their 4 quarterbacks, 1 tested positive and 3 were knuckleheads and didn't follow the protocol and weren't wearing masks. So they had to start a guy who hasn't played a down of quarterback in the NFL. He's a wide receiver and hasn't played quarterback since he was at Wake Forest, and he wasn't even a full-time starter there. And, we're going to have a game, I think it's tomorrow afternoon, with an undefeated football team because the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Baltimore Ravens had issues. Well, we're probably going to have this with the NHL. And when we do have it, it's going to be a little more agonizing because we don't play one game a week. We play 3 or 4. So if 3 guys get on the COVID list, and if it's Pittsburgh and it's Malkin and Crosby and Letang and you're starting goalie, well, that's just the way it's going to be.
And it's not like Major League Baseball where we saw teams like St. Louis and Florida make up games they had to sit out because of COVID by playing a whole bunch of doubleheaders. You can't do that in hockey. You can't have an afternoon and a night game in the same day.
No, that's true. But there's rumors that we're going to have 10 days built into the end of the season to sort of catch those games up. Now, I've been hearing, and the first person that I heard mention this was you on a podcast earlier in the season because you said, that's the way they've been doing it in rec league. I've heard that the NHL is going to have where teams will come in and play 2 or 3 games like baseball. And, with the hope that, that's less travel and you can sort of keep people contained and, we won't have not finding out that a team has 2 or 3 players positive until they've played 3 different teams. So, I think that's a good idea to do that. I mean, I think they're going to try to mitigate it, but I'm not saying that they shouldn't do it because the NFL has proved that even though there's a lot of hiccups, we still have had a season, and it looks like we're going to go to the Super Bowl. I mean, who knows? I mean, maybe we could get worse than this and we won't have it, but like right now, it looks like we're going there.
If you're the Denver Broncos, aren't you a little mad at the NFL right now? I mean, they forced them to play without a quarterback, but they keep giving Baltimore mulligans. Like, okay, you can't play on Thursday, we'll play Sunday. Okay, you can't play Sunday, we'll play Monday. How about Tuesday?
The rumor was, and it's been talked about a lot on sports radio, is that the reason the Broncos were penalized so is that they defiantly defied the protocol. They knowingly went without mask, and they're paying a price for this. So I think we're a little more sympathetic when you just get caught up by accident, but when you knowingly violate the rules and then get caught, I think we have less sympathy for you. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about how the NFL was really going to crack down. I hope that's true.
Well, I think part of the Baltimore thing too, and this is just me speculating, is Pittsburgh does have a shot at an unbeaten season, and I just wonder if the NFL, doesn't want to put that kind of asterisk almost when people say, well, you beat a team that was missing 20 players, and that doesn't really count. Or at least they're giving Baltimore a chance to kind of get somewhat healthy and field an actual NFL team on the field when they play Pittsburgh.
Well, that game was supposed to be played on Thanksgiving. The question I have in terms of the competition is if a guy wasn't going to be able to play Thursday, but he could play today, do you allow him to play?
Well, their rule is you got to have 3 consecutive days of negative tests before you're allowed back.
No, I understand that, but I don't know I didn't look at the injury list, but if they had a guy who was day to day and he wasn't going to be able to play Thursday, but whatever was ailing him, not COVID, does he get to play this game on Wednesday? No. So do they gain an advantage for having moved the game to Wednesday? So. No, I don't know. That's probably the least of their worries, I guess.
Pittsburgh already had to deal with this earlier in the year with Tennessee, where their game got canceled because Tennessee had an outbreak. So it seems like Pittsburgh's kind of been getting the shaft from other teams getting COVID also, a couple of times now, and they've had to, they lost their bye week because of that, and had to reschedule. I mean, how regimented NFL coaches are. They must any kind of deviation from the routine, they just have a conniption.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that bothers me is when you're watching football on television is how many guys on the sideline just are not abiding by the rules, especially the coaches. I watched a college game where the Rutgers coach, felt he had to take his mask down every time he talked to a player, and he couldn't shout with a mask on. And for those of us who've worn masks for an extended period, you can pretty much do in them whatever you were doing before, except eat. But you can certainly talk and yell.
Well, the worst example I saw was in a college game last week. I don't know if you saw the footage of the Texas A&M band, but they all cut holes in their masks so they could play their instruments.
Oh, jeez.
But what makes me laugh about that is these football coaches are so paranoid that, in normal circumstances, when they talk on the sideline, they cover their mouth so the spies can't see what they're saying. Well, now you've been equipped with a cover so no one can see what you're saying, and you're taking it off.
No, I know. It's just, yeah, it's, this has been a strange world, and in terms of, staying competitive. And, the only good thing out of all this is that, these are the least likely people to get sick. Not the coaches, obviously, but the players, because they're in great, physical shape. But, you still have the worry of them taking it home to their parents or whomever. So it's very complicated. And I think people are trying to do the best they can. But, and I don't think it helps, too, that we all have COVID fatigue and, we're just tired of doing it. So we get lax in our following of precautions. So anyway, as usual, it's the fastest half hour in sports. I swear the half hour is only 15 minutes. We're done before we know it, but we appreciate you tuning in and listening. And we'll be back again on Thursday with another guest and more hockey talk.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you on Thursday.